Hi, everybody, and good evening. I know it's late in the day for a lot of people. So I thought I'll keep this very quick. And my talk today is about the paradigm shift from nonprofit to social enterprise. This debate has been going on for quite a while, and I think it's still new in India, but globally there's this discussion about whether nonprofits have sort of become outdated, and do we need a more entrepreneurial approach to solving the world's social issues? So I've been involved in a couple of these discussions, and I think it happened. I think how I got involved in the discussion was I've been from the last 10 to 12 years been involved in various ventures. And I always felt like, there was something missing in my entrepreneurial journey. I felt like I needed to create some sort of a social impact. But I didn't like the way most NGOs operated. I think I felt like it was moving too slow, and I was too used to the corporate way of sort of solving issues. And that's when I discovered this entire area of social entrepreneurship, which was sort of like the Goldilocks sort of sweet spot for me. And my presentation today is sort of a little bit about my own journey of moving from a nonprofit to a social enterprise, and also some of the challenges that we've had to face along the way, and the shift in mindset, more importantly. Before I start, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. I come from an advertising and marketing background. So I spent several years, in fact, I was born into a family that was in advertising. So spent many years in advertising, decided that it was no longer for me, and then started getting involved in a bunch of social enterprises, as well as sort of managing a small marketing business on the side. I was president of Make a Difference, which was involved in educating orphans in orphanages. We used to teach English to children in about 22 cities. And I was heading the Chennai chapter at the time. I've also been involved in a small way in a bunch of other social organizations. The organization that I represent at the moment is Talking Earth, which I started about 2 years ago. Talking Earth as an organization essentially maps people's vulnerability to climate change. And we do that by taking in various data sets such as air pollution, access to healthcare, scarcity of water, quality of food, nutritional data sets, etc. And we've sort of come up with a way of indexing these different data sets and coming up with what we call a resilience score. I don't want to get too deep into what we do because it might be too complicated and too long. So I'm going to move on with the talk. Really what makes a social enterprise is how they raise money and how they spend it. And I think that's the real difference between a social enterprise, an NGO, and what we typically call a commercial enterprise. If you look at traditional NGOs, they're typically externally sustained. They receive funding in the form of either grants or what we call unearned income, which is money from non-commercial activity. They tend to be reliant on government schemes or sometimes on patrons. They're sometimes seen as inefficient. I would argue that not all NGOs are inefficient. I've seen NGOs at both ends of the spectrum. They can be sometimes slow to innovate. They get very comfortable with their ways, and they sort of they double down on processes. And very often, I think a lot of NGOs have problems attracting the right kind of talent, simply because either the talent find that NGOs don't pay them as much as they want, or that NGOs feel like they can't afford the kind of talent that they need. But NGOs also do benefit from a lot of tax benefits. And people who put in money into NGOs also receive some sort of a tax benefit. NGOs can be defined by their cause-driven nature, and they tend to be very profit-averse. Corporate enterprises sometimes are the exact opposite. They are self-sustaining. They do find they do make their own money, or they can borrow from the market. They're seen as typically fast. They have to be if they want to survive in the marketplace. They're quick to innovate, and they tend to attract a very highly skilled and well-paid talent force. They spend a lot of time trying to build brand value, and they are profit-driven versus being socially driven. And they definitely prioritize what they call shareholder value over social impact. I like to think of social enterprises as being somewhere in the middle, in what I call the Goldilocks area between an NGO and a commercial enterprise. Social enterprises try to balance the best of both worlds, which is they try to be self-sustaining in how they raise their funding without putting a financial burden on the people that they're trying to impact. And at the same time, they are also looking at creating value that people are willing to pay for. They are also driven by trying to create a brand in the marketplace, and but they don't do it at the cost of the social impact that they want to create. They're not trying to create particularly special value for their immediate shareholders. They are primarily driven by creating impact on the community. Now, these are the different ways in which social enterprises can create monetary value. The one that we use is what we call cross compensation, which is you find a group of people who need the service that you're providing but can't afford it, and you provide it to them either at a subsidized rate or you provide it to them for free. But you also find this other customer base that does have the money, also requires your service and is willing to pay for it. And you sort of use one group of customers to subsidize the other group of customers. And this is the most common form of social enterprise, which there are many examples out there in the market. The other is sort of a less popular way of of going about creating a social enterprise, which is you charge the people who need your service a small fee that is small enough for them to afford, but at the same time good enough to keep you sustainable. We have employment and skills training where you teach people how to you teach them how to perform a particular skill, and you either take some sort of a commission or you sort of earn from employing them by selling their services or their products in the market. You can also be a market intermediary, which is you can act as a distributor for a product, or you can introduce companies into a market that you have some expertise in. You can also facilitate trade relationships. I have another organization called the Bohemian House, which essentially takes products that have been created by tribes in the Nilgiris, as well as in specific parts of Orissa. We take their products and we create a trade relationship between our customers and them, and we make sure that they receive a fair price. There are many other ways in which we can go about it. I've named a few here, and if you're interested in going through this in more detail, I'm happy to share this slide with you. These are some of the examples of actual social enterprises out there. Many of these are international organizations who sort of moved away from being a purpose-driven NGO and moved more into the sweet spot where they both sell a service for a profit and at the same time look at serving the community in which they belong to. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own...
It's 8 o'clock.
Sorry about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own journey from being an NGO to a social enterprise. I think my experience in especially the Indian market is that as an NGO, it's actually really difficult to raise funds in India. You need to have a pretty long track record before companies start placing their money into your bank account. And more than that, I think it's also made more difficult by the fact that there's sort of a bad rep around NGOs in India. Just to give you an example, Tamil Nadu, which is the state that I come from, has the largest number of blacklisted NGOs in India. And this is because NGOs are sort of used as a vehicle to funnel, sometimes launder money, often by politicians, etc. But also a lot of NGOs are just either seen as being too slow or not really creating an impact in the space they wish to create an impact in. So for an environmental organization like us who work on climate change, it's actually very difficult for us to get people to empathize with the cause that we champion, simply because The environment is a very abstract sort of a term. It's not as easy to empathize with as, let's say, the cause of children. Children, we all empathize with. Uh, Whenever we see children suffer, we feel like doing something about it. Whereas the environment is sort of abstract, right? You can't put a face to it. And so, therefore, getting people to part with their money to fund an environmental project is actually extremely hard. There was a study actually done in the US, and it's actually a global problem, that found that environmental organizations are 40% less likely to receive funding than a human cause, anything to do with a human cause for that matter. And so to sort of tackle that, I spent about a year funding this organization with my own savings. I was using one organization to feed the other. And I realized that this was not really sustainable. And I think it was out of a lack of choice that we decided to turn what was initially registered as a society into a limited liability partnership. And we started using the data that we were collecting around air pollution, around green cover, etc. We started looking at ways of commercializing that data. We found a couple of partners who were willing to pay for that data. And that's how we sustain ourselves to this day. So we went from Talking Earth to Mapana, and the reason that was we we found an investor in India who initially filled the gap for us before we could find our first paying customer. And his criticism of the organization was that it was a very anglicized name, and he wanted a very Indian Bangalore sounding name. So we decided to settle on Mapana. As of today, we've been able to sustain ourselves now for the past 2 years on our own funding. The investor money was good enough to sustain us for about 2 to 3 months. And if we continue this way, we should be able to continue bootstrapping the organization for the foreseeable future. We're not actively looking for funding. And I think what has really empowered us, or what's really good about being a social enterprise is that so sometimes the need to constantly ensure an inflow of money has ensured that we are constantly innovating, and that our tools are as good as a commercial enterprise, if not better. So coming towards the end of this talk, I think for a lot of NGOs or for a lot of people who are looking to start a social organization, the key question is, if I'm already an NGO, how do I transition to a social enterprise? The first question I think you need to ask yourself is whether being a social enterprise is right for you. And the way you can assess that is by trying to figure out what kind of mindset that you're in. To be in a social entrepreneurial sort of a mindset means that you need to think about how to sell your product. And it means getting into difficult areas such as sales and marketing, which is something that a lot of NGOs, I understand, are completely averse to, simply because it comes from this mindset of being profit averse. And if that is not a shift that you're willing to make, then you're probably better off being an NGO. But if you feel the pain of being an NGO, which is that sometimes you're subservient to your stakeholders, people who donate generously to your cause, or sometimes you're subservient to certain government rules or regulations, it might be a better switch for you to become a social enterprise. You need to be willing to sort of take on the burden of thinking about sales, thinking about creating value for your customers, and being open to serving multiple stakeholders in the market, and not just being socially driven. So there are all these sort of pressures that you need to balance, and if you're willing to take that on, then being a social enterprise is definitely for you. A good way to look at to test some of your ideas is to come up with a business model. And I will share a tool, a very simple tool to come up with a business model. It's called the Business Model Canvas. It's a very popular tool among startups, especially in India. And it's a simple one-page tool that forces you to think about who your stakeholders are, who are you creating value for, where is your revenue going to come from, who are you reliant on to ensure that this business model is a success, and all of those things that you need to sort of think about along the way. The second thing you need to think about is the shift in mindset, not just for yourself, but also for your staff. So what kind of training modules you need to sort of come up with to get your staff on board with this shift? The next thing you need to do is sort of prototype your business model in a small space. And when I say prototype, what I mean is really test your ideas against a small group of people who represent your potential customers, and see whether they would be willing to put money into your organization for the service or the product that you've developed. The next thing you need to do is, obviously, you're never going to get it perfect the first time. So you need to keep iterating, which means you need to come up with a version 2 of your plan, a version 2 of your business model. And you need to keep testing and seeing whether you're actually moving forward with your product or your service. Are you getting better? Are you reaching closer to that Goldilocks sort of space? And the last part is market validation. So market validation is where you've prototyped your product or your service long enough that you're relatively confident that it will do well if you put it out there in the market and if you compete with all the other people in the market. So what you would do is you would actually try to partner up with people who can help you sell your product or your service and see whether they're actually willing to come on board. This is the business model canvas. The business model canvas is a one-page business plan. This is particularly designed for social entrepreneurs and social businesses. The original business model is actually only designed for commercial enterprises. But this is obviously tweaked to sort of help you figure out where your where the surplus from all of your commercial activity is going to go. So I encourage you to Google this. It's called the Social Business Model Canvas. It will give you exactly what you're seeing here on my slide. And what this thing does is, it's a step-by-step. You'll notice that there are numbered segments. So it says number 1 segments. So these are the different customers that you will be targeting. Some might be people that you give your service or your product away for free or at a subsidized rate. And the others might be the customers that you actually sell it to at a premium. So you will identify those people here. The second stage will describe the kind of intervention. So are you going to have a product? Are you going to have a service? Is it going to be a combination of both? Is it going to be a training module that you're selling, etc.? So like that, you go about each of these steps. And if you go to the website where I picked this up from, you'll have the logo on the top right. You can Google this. They actually describe each section and how you go about filling out that section. And this is a good way to start your thought process within the organization and to assess whether your organization is ready to shift over to a social enterprise. With that, I come to the end of my talk.